Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Annabel Crabb. Coming up, is Kevin Rudd the best friend Julian Assange has in the Australian Cabinet? Does the government's new banking package have any friends whatsoever? And should Australia import cheap foreign labour to build major projects? Our panel tonight, Julian Morrow from The Chaser and currently standing in for Fran Kelly on ABC Radio National Breakfast. David Hetherington, the Executive Director of the Per Capita think tank. And joining us from Melbourne, the Executive Director of another think tank, John Roskam from the Institute of Public Affairs.
I need to just jump in and clarify immediately that The Chaser is in no way a think tank of any sort.
Well, I will not include you in the think-off that we have planned for David and John later on. Well, look, something unusual does seem to be happening with the Australian government as it confronts the daily drip of compromising information from WikiLeaks. The man with the most to lose from the disclosures, Kevin Rudd, the Foreign Minister, is nonetheless emerging as Julian Assange's strongest defender within the government. In an interview with the Australian newspaper in Cairo, the Foreign Minister has indicated he may intervene personally to ensure that the WikiLeaks founder has access to a laptop and anything else he needs to prepare his defence from his London prison cell. Mr Rudd has also signalled that any chat about taking away Mr Assange's passport would have to get past him first. Julian Assange's lawyers believe their client is sure to be charged under the United States 1917 Espionage Act, which has been dusted off for the express purpose. Julian Morrow, what do you think Kevin Rudd's up to here?
Well, I suspect that Kevin is a man who has some sympathy for a blonde-haired man who has no friends in the world. I think there's that's a natural affinity between the two. But you've got to say that, you know, the Prime Minister and the Attorney General really stuffed up the response to the WikiLeaks issue last week and kind of jumped on the deep end saying they're going to cancel the passport and all that sort of stuff. And Rudd is probably naturally well cast to play this role as Foreign Minister and protector of Australians overseas. I was reading the Passports Act on the web just before we came on air. Something I wouldn't recommend you do. Yeah,
as you do.
Indeed. But it does turn out that it's the Foreign Minister who has responsibility for cancelling passports. And, you know, Australia doesn't have a good track record in defending its citizens when they face charges overseas. And it's a real time where it's important for people who believe in the rule of law and proper process to step up. Kevin Rudd is capable of that. He knows the way international diplomacy works. And I think that he's probably performing best in anyone in the government.
It's interesting. Well, David, do you think that the message about who possesses ultimate passport responsibility was a pointed one?
Well, I think there's a couple of messages in there, aren't there? At one level, Kevin Rudd's doing exactly what an Australian Foreign Minister should do, which is to ensure that the rights of an Australian facing charges overseas are being respected. But it's curious that he's choosing to put as much space as he can between the government's initial posturing last week, which was probably a misjudgment in the first couple of days, and him as the leader of the debate at the moment. And I suspect there's some schadenfreude going on his part there.
John Roskam, if I can bring you in for a moment, how would you expect the Australian government to respond, you know, if the American government does press charges under the 1917 Espionage Act?
Well, look, what Kevin Rudd should do is what he should do for any citizen, but this is about Kevin Rudd appealing to the left wing of the Labor Party, trying to get those votes. This is about Kevin Rudd getting his revenge on Julia Gillard. This is about, as you say, Kevin Rudd showing he's in control. Kevin Rudd, as we know, loved the power of the pen as Prime Minister and now as Foreign Minister. And that's what this is about. I don't think he's got any more love for Julian Assange than anyone else, but this is about him versus Gillard.
Well, I mean, I think that's a bit tough, I've got to say, John. I mean, he may be getting that sort of byproduct of fun and schadenfreude, but he's also standing up for proper principle here, isn't he?
Well, look, he should stand up for principle, and Julian, you mentioned the rule of law and process. Mate, Julian Assange is not into the rule of law. He's not into process.
Yeah, but you don't choose who the rule of law applies to, and the history of the criminal law is that these rights are designed for people no matter what charges they are faced with, and that is exactly when the rule of law should apply. You don't only apply it to glamour, feel-good candidates.
Look, that's right, but we have to be careful when we are trying to apply a rule of law to a bloke who thinks it doesn't apply to him.
But what evidence is there to suggest that it doesn't apply to him? I mean, the fact that the Americans have to dust off a 1917 Espionage Act to try and find an offence which he might have committed suggests that there's a pretty long bow being drawn about the nature of the illegality of his acts.
Well, look, we don't know yet whether it is illegal, and both of you are right that last week the government got it wrong saying this is automatically an illegal act. But whether it's illegal or not, it's not good for government, it's not good for the process, and we have to work through that. And Kevin Rudd has to do what he can as Foreign Minister to look after an Australian citizen, but he shouldn't be doing it with any love whatsoever. Well,
in the interim, of course, the Attorney-General has taken the very prudent step of asking the Australian Federal Police to have a look into the question of whether they should be asked to have a look at this, and we can assume that that will progress over the Christmas period, and we'll send you updates as regularly as we can. But moving on to another big story today, the government has finally unveiled its banking package, and it's the sort of Christmas package that you'd only get from a treasurer, really. Wayne Swan has announced that from July next year, mortgage exit fees on new home loans, variable home loans, will be scrapped, and the ACCC will have greater powers to investigate price signalling. Now, the big banks aren't celebrating, at least not publicly, while smaller lenders, who would make up the new fifth pillar of banking, say that it won't help them much either. Undeterred, Treasurer Wayne Swan has been selling his wares with a vengeance.
Why we've brought this package in is to make the market much more competitive, to remove some of those barriers that lock their customers in and don't give them the ability to walk down the street and get a better deal where it already exists. These are good measures. They will be effective and enduring, and the country needs it for banking competition and economic prosperity.
But the Shadow Treasurer says it's more about political relief for the government than mortgage relief for families.
If it was reform, it would be considered, it would be detailed, it would be across the board. It's not reform. And this is the fact the government had a long press conference on a Sunday in front of the Australian flag with two nodding heads behind him says that the government's trying to spin this up as something far more significant than what it really is.
From Joe Hockey, who would, of course, never stage a long press conference on a Sunday. John Roskam, there is a lot of detail in this package, but no measure that could solidly be predicted to bring down interest rates. Was it unrealistic to expect otherwise, do you think?
Well, it was absolutely unrealistic, and the government's been playing catch-up ever since Joe Hockey started this bank-bashing exercise. And there's one important reform, Annabel, you haven't mentioned, which is we're now going to get a new government logo on some banking products.
Au contraire, Mr Roskam, I was planning to come to the logo later, but thank you for...
Oh, well, I'm sorry. But look, this is the extent of the reforms. We've got logos, we've got some slogans. Look, the Australian people can't have it both ways. We can't want a profitable banking system that withstands the pressures of the GFC, but then on the other hand, stop the banks making profits.
Well, this is a kind of an attempt to build a fifth pillar. Julian, Morrow, the government has kind of assembled an extra pillar out of bits of old credit unions and building societies. You know, what does this policy do for that sector, in your opinion?
Well, it kind of, the fifth pillar reminds me of one of those games of Jenga, a kind of carefully constructed pillar that may not stand up very strong. I'm not sure that, I mean, if competition between the big four is not enough, I'm not sure that this fifth cobbled together pillar will do much. And certainly, so the head of the Bank of Queensland today came out and said he thought that these measures were pretty superficial and set back the agenda of trying to construct a genuine fifth column 10 or 15 years. There are some good things in the reforms, and certainly things like allowing the development of a bullet bond structure and issuing covered bonds, stuff about which I know a huge amount, which I'll tell you about later.
I was very confident.
You sound very knowledgeable.
Yeah, wonderful session.
Those things seem to have been welcomed, but this is a kind of hodgepodge of policies. There's a raft of things which are hopelessly superficial, and some things which seem really interesting. I mean, the government's talking about consumer empowerment. I think that they may have been affected by the presence of Oprah in Australia, just talking about self-empowerment. But the idea of an automatic account number that can be electronically transferred between banks strikes me as a really good one. Far more ambitious, far more difficult to introduce, but that seems to me to be something which, if it gets through the Bernie Fraser review, would in fact make it much easier for consumers to exercise their power.
I can see you're dying to think tank on this, David.
That's
Please
right.
oblige us.
Look, I think the account number portability is an example of the kind of thing that we've seen work well in mobile phones that could also kind of translate to banking. I actually think there are a number of good measures in this reform package announced, and I think it's pretty rich of Joe Hockey to decry the measures when he led the running on this.
Well, three of them are his, to be fair.
That's right. That's right. So look, think about banning exit fees. In what other sector and what other product would you be locked in for a 25, 30-year commitment?
Well, Nick Xenophon talks about this as the holy grail of reform in this area. He said that one day changing banks could be just as easy as changing power companies,
right.
Which goes to show how rarely he changes power companies. So continue.
And in a sense, I think it's wrong of the government to cast it as the construction of a fifth pillar. I think what they need to do is to introduce more competition by breaking down some of those barriers to switching that you see in there. It's also an important step to give the ACCC powers to act on this stuff. I mean, in airline freight and in cardboard boxes, we don't allow people to signal to each other in advance of price movements. But banks regularly have been getting up and saying, well, we anticipate that in the near term we will need to move rates by X and Y. You wouldn't get away with that in any other sector. So I think it's time we moved on that in banking.
One of the suggestions made today was that the abolition of exit fees would actually damage smaller practitioners in the banking and allied sector, because that's what they rely on to actually keep their margins going. Any thoughts about that?
Well, it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because there's no doubt that the exit fees are used by many institutions to kind of get one last gouge of the customer on the way out or to keep them in. So, I mean, I'm pretty partial to the idea of banning the exit fees, but I also have great faith in the larger institutions to find devious ways of not only recovering those lost fees but increasing fees overall. And I think that if you're serious about consumer empowerment, then the sorts of electronic facilitation devices we're talking about are going to be far more effective.
Well, keep the faith there for a minute, Julian. We're moving on to a slightly more radical proposal that was floated today. A leading demographer has proposed that Australia should, to get big public works projects off the ground, introduce cheap foreign labour. Professor Peter MacDonald from ANU says Australia's lagging behind other developed nations on civil infrastructure like highways, and it's time to consider bringing in cheap foreign contract workers to do the job. Now, of course, unions hate the idea. They argue it's up to companies to invest in training so that local workers will have better skills. David, Professor MacDonald reckons we've happily opened up every other aspect of Australian industry to competition, so why not labour supply?
Well, labour supply is open to competition. We compete with global labour markets all the time on those skills that are transferable. For certain things, however, like personal services, like construction work, you just can't have a completely mobile global labour pool. I think the proposal